Big.
All
right, good morning, everybody. We are at the very, very top of Ayin Bay's Amid Aleph, the very first words of the page. Yesterday, we stopped quite literally, almost like mid-sentence, certainly mid-Shakla Vitaria. So I think it makes sense to take about a minute or two to just reorient ourselves. It's a very complicated sugya, and we are, like I said, smack in the middle. There was just really no good place to stop. So again, we're in the very last daf of this parak, a very technical parak. And what the entire parak has generally been dealing with, all of the various mishnayos, is when a person sells various things, right? Be it an ear, a sada, a bias, a beis abad, all of these things. There are a number of things that are not included. And yesterday, in the very last mishnah of the parak, we got a bit of a curveball. And the mishnah said that all of these halachas that say that certain things are not included in a sale, that's dafka when it comes to a sale. But when it comes to a matana, oh yes, please. But when it comes to a matana, if the person who was, the mocher, if he wasn't a mocher, but in fact he was a nosein matana, then all of these things that were excluded are going to be included. And this is this idea that generally when a person is a mocher, he's a mocher ba'ayin ra, but when he's a nosein matana, he's nosein ba'ayin yafa. And that was the distinction between a mocher and a nosein. Having said that, as we've seen throughout this parak a number of times, and we saw it again yesterday, that even within mocher ba'ayin ra, there's a machlokas Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim. Rabbi Akiva says that even though, as a general matter, a mocher is mocher ba'ayin ra, having said that, even though when a mocher is a mocher ba'ayin ra, having said that, there are certain things that he's still mocher ba'ayin yafet, meaning even though when I sell, a field, I retain certain trees, or I retain a bar, or something like that, but I'm mocher ba'ayin yafet to the point where I will give the buyer all of the land, and I'll have to separately negotiate with the buyer an easement to get to my thing. Ayin Beis Amid Aleph. The Chachamim disagree, and they say no, mocher ba'ayin ra, and therefore, if you retain the thing, you retain it, and that's that. The question in the Mishnah that we dealt with yesterday was, where does being makdish fit in? Is makdish like a mocher, or is makdish like a nosein matana? And we saw again, it was a machlokas tanaim between the Chachamim and Rav Shimon. Okay. Again, we saw it was a machlokas of Shimon and the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that when you're makdish, you're just like a nosein matana, and therefore when you're makdish, one slide up, please. And therefore, when you're makdish, everything goes to hektish. Rav Shimon says, no, it's more like a mecher, and therefore you're makdish ba'ayin ra, you're makdish, and therefore a lot of these things, all the various things in the parak, you hold back. Having said that, Rav Shimon still said that it's kind of like Rabbi Akiva's version almost, in that there are certain things that clearly, even though you hold back, you definitely give to hektish, including the sycamore tree and the carob tree, and as you saw yesterday, there's a specific reason why those things are included. Okay, that was kind of the Mishnah and everything. But then we saw yesterday at kind of the, I would say the end of the plot, even though it was really on Ayin Amid Aleph, we saw a member of Rav Huna. And Rav Huna said that when you sell a field, you retain trees, and even though you retain those trees, you also retain the land in between the trees. And when we learned this, we said this sounds like Shitas Chachamim as opposed to Rabbi Akiva. This is the Chachamim throughout the parak that have said mocher ba'ayin ra mocher. Yet the Gemara tried to fit in and say, no, this is actually Rabbi Akiva. And that whole thing, this is all yesterday's stuff. How can it also be Rabbi Akiva? The problem is, the Gemara said, and this is really where we left off yesterday, is it can't be Rabbi Akiva because that wouldn't fit with the way we were understanding Rav Shimon. Meaning Rav Shimon in our Mishnah by Hektish seems to be saying like Rabbi Akiva. And if that's true, then the only way to make sense from Rav Shimon's halacha that when you're makdish, nothing is included in Hektish with the exception of these trees. Why did we say that Rav Shimon says these trees, the sycamore tree and the carob tree, have to go to Hektish? It's because they're yonik from the ground, which means that the ground had to go to Hektish. This sounds like Rabbi Akiva, and this was a problem. Meaning, Rav Huda's halacha had to be dafka within the Shitas of Chachamim because Rav Shimon had to be going aliba to Rabbi Akiva. And that's really where we left off yesterday. Again, I know we spent a lot of time kind of chazering all this, but it's it's all going to be very relevant in today's daf. Today's daf is very much a continuation of yesterday's daf. Okay, but anyway, the top line of Ayin Beis Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, "Umi masas mukmasla l'Rav Shimon Rabbi Akiva." Is it really true that you can say that Shitas Rav Shimon in our Mishnah is because he goes like Rabbi Akiva, meaning that when I makdish property, when I makdish trees, the property belongs to hektish? Is that really true? V'hatanya, we have a brisa in Erechim, and this is a brisa that deals with the very complicated halachas of a stay achuza. So what's a stay achuza? What does all this stuff mean? We know that if you have literally ancestral land, this is property that was passed down generation to generation from Yeshua ben Nun all the way down, and you are makdish this property, now you want to be pot of the property. Normally, when I'm pot, if I makdish my car and I want to be pot of my car, I have to pay the Kelly Blue Book value or whatever it is, plus a chomesh, whatever it is, and then that's how I do it. When it comes to a se'achuza, it's a whole different formula. It's this formula that the Torah says it's based zera homer sa'orim b'chamishin shekel kesef. It's a whole formula. 50 shekel kesef is actually prorated based on where we are in the Yovel cycle. But the point is, if I makdish a se'achuza and I want to be voted, there's a whole separate formula as to how I calculate the value. When it comes to anything else, I'm just quoting the value. So here we have a brisa in Erechim, Vatanya, hektish, shlosha, ilonos, mimata, asar lebeisa. This is just a formula of density. So Rashbam reminds us that earlier in the Masechta we said that 10 trees along this amount of a base there's a certain density, that's the right amount of density. And all this Mishnah is saying is that if I was makdish 3 ilonos with that level of density, so whatever that means, the proper amount of density, hare hektish is a karka, ve'eso ilonos shebinehem. I makdish what's almost like it's viewed as I makdish the entire field, and therefore not only am I makdish these 3 trees, I'm also makdish the karka in between the trees and any of the smaller trees that are in between these trees. Lafikach, therefore, this is the punchline. Lafikach kishu poda beis zera chomer sa'orim b'chamishim shekel kesef. We view it as this was like a se'achuza, this was like a proper field, and therefore, but when I want to be poda from hektish, I have to go based on this se'achuza formula. But pachos mikan, let's say, or yoser alkain, let's say the amount that I was makdish had greater density or less density. Oh, sheikdishim bezachar zeh, it was the right amount of density, but I didn't do 3 trees. I did tree 1, and then the next day I did tree 2, and the next day I did tree 3. Harezeh lo hektish, lo asakarka, below us ilonos shebenehem. I'm only makdish the trees. I'm not makdish the land, and I'm not makdish the smaller trees. Lapikach, therefore, kishahu poda, when I want to be podes, it's not considered a se'achuza, and podes ilonos bishaven. I have to be poda the value of the trees, like whatever their value is, as if I was makdish my base or whatever it is. It's not like I makdish the se'achuza. Below od, the Brisa says, not only this, ela afilu hikdish asar ilonos. Let's say I was makdish the ilonos one after one. So I didn't do all 3 at the same time, but I was makdish the ilonos one after one. But because of a hikdish is a karka. But then I went back and I was makdish everything else. So at the end of the day, right now, I was makdish all 3 trees with the right amount of density. Still, it doesn't matter. Kashu poda ilonos b'shaven. I have to be poda the trees at their fair market value. The chozaru poda beis arachomer sa'orim b'chamishim shekel kesef. And again, the safe of the Brisa is very much going to be the topic of Amud Beis. But the point is, what do we see from this Brisa? So what we see clearly is that when I makdish less than 3 trees, I'll makdish 2 trees or whatever it is, I am not makdish the land in between the trees. That's what the Brisa said before. So the Gemara says, let's understand this. Money. Who is the author of this Brisa? Rabbi Akiva, is it Rabbi Akiva? But we just said in our lengthy introduction, Ha'amar mocher ba'ayin yafe mocher, the kol shekein makdish. If Rabbi Akiva says that when you sell trees to a buyer, you sell the land in between the trees, right? So for sure, when I makdish the trees, I'm going to be makdish the land in between the trees. And Rabbanan, and if you're going to tell me it's the Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan in our Mishnah were very clear that makdish ba'ayin yafe makdish, right? See it inside. Ha'amri mocher hu ba'ayin ra mocher. The Rabbanan will say that a mocher is ayin ra, aval makdish ba'ayin yafa makdish. So we see it can't be the Chachamim, it can't be Rabbi Akiva. So who is this Tana of this Brisa? Ela pshita Reb Shimon. It's got to be Reb Shimon. And now the Gemara says again, but Reb Shimon aliba to who, right? Reb Shimon aliba deman. Granted, it's Reb Shimon, but who is Reb Shimon going like? And a fascinating, by the way, Rashbam, very short Rashbam. If you look at the third of the wide lines, Reb Shimon aliba deman. We know that who is Reb Shimon in the Gemara? It's Reb Shimon bar Yochai. Right. So who was his Rebbe? His Rebbe was, of course, Rabbi Akiva. The Rashbam quotes the famous Gemara in Yavamis, the Laga Omer Gemara, that he had the 24,000 Talmidim, and then they died, and then who were one of his Talmidim was, of course, the great Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. So it would make sense that Rav Shimon would be saying this aliba to Rabbi Akiva. But the problem is, the Gemara says, aliba Rabbi Akiva. We just said, Amar Mocher ba'ayin Yafeh Mocher, B'kol Shekain Makdish. Ela Pshita aliba d'Rabbanan. Rather, you are going to have to say that this is Rav Shimon who's going aliba d'Rabbanan. Because of Rav Shimon, Kihechi de Mocher ba'ayin Ra Mocher, just like the Rabbanan say that Mocher is ba'ayin Ra Mocher, Makdish Nami ba'ayin Ra Makdish, and therefore Rumashayir Rav Shimon's going to have to be saying aliba d'Ra the Chachamim, that just like they say that Mocher is ba'ayin Ra Mocher, so too when you're Makdish, it's ba'ayin Ra Makdish. That's why you are not Makdish the field in between these trees, and that's how we can understand this brisa of the Se'achuzah. The problem is, why do we bring all of this? We have a whole Amud Gemara. What was the point of all this? The point was that we ended yesterday's daf by saying it had to be, the only way to make sense from Rav Huna is to say that that Rav Shimon was going aliba to Rabbi Akiva. We had this whole brisa from Erechin to show us that Rav Shimon clearly is not paskening like Rabbi Akiva. So we've got a problem with the Rav Huna. But the Gemara says we have a much more fundamental issue than all of this. The Gemara says, "Ve'ella kasha hol yonkin mistay hektish." The Gemara says, "Well, I don't understand." Fine, maybe I'll tell you you're right. That Rav Huna, I don't know how we're going to understand Rav Huna. Don't we have a much more fundamental issue within Rav Shimon himself? We have this brisa in Erechin, which we're trying to say is Rav Shimon, which very clearly says that when I makdish two trees, I am not makdish the field in between the trees. But on the other hand, we have a Mishnah here in Baba Basra, that Ayin Aleph Amid Aleph, where Rav Shimon clearly says that when I makdish two trees, I am makdish the field in between the trees, right? So we have a steer in Rav Shimon. How are we supposed to understand this? The Gemara says, you're right, the El Rav Shimon, the Debrem, the Rabbanan, Ka'amar Lahu. Rav Shimon is not, when on our Mishnah, on Ayin Aleph Amid Aleph, that's not Rav Shimon L'shita. So that's Rav Shimon saying, Aliba to the Chachamim. He's saying like this. Lididi, from my perspective, just like I said in Erechin, Yehi democher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, makdish nami ba'ayin ra'a makdish, b'shur mishayir. And therefore, from my perspective, when I makdish, you would not give the land to Hektish, you would keep the land for yourself. But lididchu, according to you, the Chachamim, oduli miha delo Hektish elachar v'amurka v'sadam hashikma. Even if you're going to tell me that generally, when you're hektish ba'ayin yafeh, still there are certain things that you would have to agree with me that have to be left out. And ba'amir le'Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan weren't convinced, and they said lo shna. Bottom line, the Rabbanan weren't convinced, and now we've figured out a way to make Rav Shimon work. Rav Shimon really holds like he does in Erechin, that hektish is ba'ayin ra hektish. What's going on in our Mishnah in Baba Basra? That's not really Rav Shimon L'shita. So that's what Rav Shimon talking to the Chachamim and saying, at least promoted to me that these things would not be included in Hektish. And again, the Rabbanan were unconvinced. Fine. But the bottom line is, going back to our case in Erechin, we had a very complicated brisa in Erechin. And by the seifa and what we said, this brisa was Rav Shimon. And now the Gemara is going to ask, how could you tell me this brisa is Rav Shimon from the seifa of the brisa? It seems like it's very much not Rav Shimon. So the Gemara says, "B'mayu came to like Rav Shimon. You were just mukim this brisa and Erechin like Rav Shimon. Aim a seifa. Look at the seifa. What did the seifa say? Right? What did the Reisha say? The Reisha said that when I makdish certain trees with a certain amount of density, I makdish se'achuzah. But if I do it a different way, it's not a se'achuzah. And most importantly, if I makdish trees and then I makdish other things later, it's not a se'achuzah because I first did the trees and then I did everything else. So the Bryce said below ode, elafilu hikdish eso ilanos. If I first was makdish the trees, because hikdish was the karka, and then I was makdish the karka. Meaning, if we took a snapshot right now, I was really makdish everything. And in theory, the halachas of the se'achuzah should apply. But we look at what actually happened, right? We go back and we say, well, first I did the trees and then I did the karka. Therefore, kshu poda. But the Gemara says, the ear of Shimon, if you're telling me this was Rav Shimon, Lazel Basar Pidyon, Benifraku Agav Arayu. You shouldn't view it this way. Rav Shimon L'shitaso, he would say that you should look at everything as if it was a se'achuzah, and therefore it should be subject to the halachas of se'achuzah. Because we know that Rav Shimon holds the azal basar pidyon. When it comes to these halachas, he takes a very like Hakuna Matata style approach. And he's like, we don't look at the past, right? We focus on the here and now, and the here and now says that this is, you are makdish everything. This is the se'achuza, and therefore it should be subject to the pidyon rules of se'achuza. How do we know that? That's Rav Shimon's approach. Titania, we have another brisa in Erechim. And the case, again, bottom line, what's a se'achuza? A se'achuza is if I was makdish a field that I got through inheritance, literally from Yeshua ben Nun to me. But what if I bought a field? If I bought a field, now it's a sadeh mikneh, and it has a whole different set of rules. So the Bryce is going to deal with a very unique case. What if I bought a field from my father? And then I was makdish. So in theory, had I just waited, right? Maybe I would have yarshin this field, and then if I was makdish, it would have been a se'achuza. But I didn't wait, and I bought it. Kind of a dumb move, perhaps. But I bought it, and then I was makdish it. So how do we view this, right? That's what this Bryce is dealing with. Maybe as a brother, very good. So the Tanya, we have a brisa. Minayin lokach sada me'aviv. Let's say I bought a field from my father, the hikdisha, and then I was makdish it. But va'achar kach meis aviv, and then my father dies. Minayin shnei lefanav k'se'achuza. So you might have a havim that this isn't a se'achuza. I bought it from my father, but the brisa says no, this is considered a se'achuza. How do I know? Tamalomer, the pasuk says ve'im es stay mikna so asher lo mise'achuza so, and we learn from this. The only time you have a sadeh mikna is if it wasn't ever ra'i to become a se'achuza. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon say that from the pasuk we say that the only time the rules of say mikna apply is if it could never have been a se'achuza. Here, because it was my father's property, it could have become a se'achuza, and therefore it's subject to the rules of se'achuza. Rav Meir argues, and he says no. Minayin the lokach sada me'aviv. He learns this same halacha, but to a different case. It's where I bought the field from my father, umeis aviv, but then my father dies before I was able to be makdish it. So then I makdish it, meaning by the time I makdish it, it already would have been right for me to have yarshined it. That's the case. The point is, the cases are similar, but there's one important nuance. In both of the cases, a son buys property from the father. And in both of the cases, the son then goes and is makdish the field. The only difference between the cases is when did the father die? In Rav Shimon's case, first he was makdish it, and then the father died. In Rav Meir's case, first the father died, and then he was makdish. In theory, Rav Meir's case is much smaller chiddush, because the bottom line is by the time I was makdish this field, I really was right to have yarshined it. My father had already died. In theory, it was already a se'achuza, even though I bought it. But the point is, before I was even makdish it, I was already technically yarshin, right? I was at least yoresh, right? The purchase price, right? Whatever cash I gave, I now got back, right? Rav Shimon's case is much more mechudishtik. He says that even if I was makdish it while my father was still alive, still that case is a se'achuza. So the Gemara says like this: Ve'il Rabbi Yehuda Reb Shimon, according to Rabbi Yehuda Reb Shimon. Now the Bach takes out the next bunch of words, so we're going to skip it too. Skip to the next line. Second to last word is Heicha de Hekdisha. So again, Ve'il Rabbi Yehuda Reb Shimon, Heicha de Hekdisha, where I was makdish, v'achar kach meis aviv. In their case, where I was first makdish, and then my father died. Minalahu. How do they know? Meaning the Gemara is saying, how do I know to skip the smaller chiddush and jump to the bigger chiddush? If it's only because of this pasuk, but Emel Rav Meir, I should really have to learn the smaller chiddush. That halacha only applies when first my father died and then I was makdish it. It must be mishum da azli basar pidyon, because they hold of this akuna matata style approach. That every single time we have a question like this, we always view the pidyon, we always view it at the time I was makdish, and the bottom line, or sorry, at the time of the pidyon, and at that point, clearly it was my field, so they didn't even feel they needed a pasuk for the smaller chiddush. The only pasuk they needed is for the larger chiddush. But what do we see from here? Clearly, we see that this brisa should not have been Rav Shimon, because the seif of the brisa doesn't go like Rav Shimon. But the Gemara is stocha that it says, nah, maybe not so much. Amar Rav Yitzchak la'olam ba'alma Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon lo azli basar pidyon. So how do they know to jump the smaller chiddush to go to the bigger chiddush? They have a different pasuk. Basically, im kain lichtov kra beim es stemikna. So asharlo achuzaso, meaning why does it say mistei achuzaso? The word mistei is extra. Inami stei achuzaso. The pasuk could have said stei achuzaso. The mem is extra. My asharlo mistei achuzaso. As she'ena ruya lios stei achuza yasazuzu sharuya lios stei achuza. The bottom line is they have a different drasha, and therefore because they have a different drasha, you can't It's not muchach necessarily that they hold the sakuna matata approach, and therefore you can say that the brisa in Erechin is Reb Shimon. And not from here at the end of the parak, we go on much lighter stuff, much less complicated, and we'll be done in just a minute. So Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna says like this: Harv hamurka v'sadan hashikma. These trees that we've learned a lot about over the last few days. This is a carob tree, a certain sycamore tree. Toras Elon alav, the Toras Karka alav. In one way, it has a Toras Elon. Halacha views it like an Elon, which we'll see is very buyer friendly, and in other ways, it has a Toras Karka alav. It's viewed as Karka and halacha, which is very seller friendly. Toras Elon alav. No, this is a sycamore tree and a carob tree that are right in a field. That's the Harv Hamurkov. I think that's kind of true. I think. I don't know. Either way. So how does it have the Torah Elon alav? Did I skip a line? Torah Elon alav. Aktish Ozavan Shnei Elonos Mahai Yeshlo Karka. Because we know there's a halacha that we're going to learn in about a week when Yoel comes back, that whenever I sell 3 trees, the buyer gets the karka. So notwithstanding everything that we've said, if I sell 3 trees, the buyer always gets the karka. So these trees are viewed as trees, meaning if I sold 2 trees and one of these trees, they're viewed as a tree, and therefore the buyer gets the karka. At the same time, Torah's karka, but also as a Torah's karka for all the halachas in our parak. The lom is davin agav ara. So like the Mishnah said, and Daf Samach Chasam Beis, that when I sell a field, included in the field is not these trees. If they were a regular tree, maybe they would have been. But these trees have a certain chashivas on their own, and they're not viewed as a tree. They're really viewed as karka, and therefore they would not be included in the sale. So on the one hand, these trees are considered trees for purposes of halacha A. On the other hand, they're viewed as karka for purposes of halacha B. Similarly, V'amar Abuna, Omer, Sheyesh Bo Satayim, Torah's Omer alav, and Torah's Gadish alav. So this takes us to the halacha of Shechach. The person is in the field and they're working their field and they're doing whatever. If they forget 1 sheaf or 2 sheaves, you have the halachas of shechita. If they forget 3 sheaves, that's already something that's chashuv, and therefore shechita doesn't apply. So what happens if you have this omer sheyesh bo satan? You have a very, very, very large sheaf. So again, it's kind of this unique status in halacha. It has Torah's omer alav and Torah's gadish alav. The Gemara says Torah's omer alav, the shnei omrim Shechacha, because 2 omrim generally have the halacha of shechacha, but shnayim behu, 2 omrim and this massive omer, which is 2 satayim, would be 3, and therefore einan shechacha. So again, it counts as a regular omer in terms of pottering the other 2 from shechacha. But at the same time, Torah's gadish alav. It's not omer sheyesh bo satayim shechacha ein shechacha. If this was the only thing you forgot, this massive omer, you could say, well, it's 1 omer, so it's shechacha. No. It's so large that on its own, it pater shechacha. So it's interesting. On its own, it pater shechacha. But notwithstanding that, if it's with 2 other things, you don't view it as like 2 omrim and then this thing on the side to make the other 2 subject to shechacha. No. You view that as a regular omer to pater the other 2. So it's kind of always good for the landowner. Amar Rabba Barachana, Amar Rish Lakish, Harv Hamurkav, the Sadan Hashikma, this machlokas that we had in our Mishnah when you're makdish a field, how do you view the Charv Hamurkav and the Sadan Hashikma, Barula, machlokas, Reb Menachem, Reb Yossi, Ve'Rabban. We have this machlokas of Reb Menachem, Reb Yossi, Ve'Rabban. Now we would say, if you're learning this, you're saying, what are you talking about? Who's Reb Yossi, bro? Who's Menachem, Reb Yossi? This is the machlokas for Shimon and the Chachamim from our Mishnah. The Gemara says, "B'leima machlokas of Shimon Ve'Rabban." Who is this person? Why isn't this Reb Shimon Ve'Rabban? Hakamash Malan, Reb Menachem, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon. The only point that Rabba Barachana was trying to say was trying to tell us that Reb Menachem, Reb Yossi holds like Reb Shimon. It's the same machlokas.